The autumn wind whistled through the oak trees surrounding Grace Baptist Church in Millbrook, a quiet town nestled in the heart of Tennessee. Pastor David Coleman stood in his study, rehearsing tomorrow's Sunday school lesson one final time. The leather-bound Bible in his hands felt heavier than usual as he traced the verses about truth and deception with his weathered finger. At 52, David had shepherded this congregation for nearly 15 years. His warm smile and gentle demeanor had earned him the trust of every family in Millbrook. Children would run to him after service, and teenagers sought his counsel during their most troubled moments. To his wife Sarah and 17-year-old daughter Emma, he was simply Dad, the man who never missed a family dinner and always had time for bedtime prayers. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from, and don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel by clicking the icon in the bottom right corner of your screen. Now let's get into the story. That Saturday evening, David seemed unusually quiet during dinner. Sarah noticed how he pushed his meatloaf around his plate, barely eating. Emma chattered about her upcoming homecoming dance, but her father's responses were distracted, almost mechanical. "You feeling all right, honey?" Sarah asked, reaching across the table to touch his hand. Her wedding ring caught the light from the chandelier above their modest dining room. David forced a smile. "Just thinking about tomorrow's lesson. Want to make sure I get it right." The lesson was about the woman caught in adultery, a topic David had taught countless times before. But tonight, something felt different. The words seemed to stick in his throat during his practice sessions. After dinner, David retreated to his home office while Sarah and Emma watched their Saturday night movie. Through the thin walls, they could hear the muffled sound of phone calls. David's voice was hushed, urgent, but they couldn't make out the words. This wasn't unusual. As a pastor, David often received calls from parishioners in crisis. Around 10:30, Sarah knocked on his office door. "David, I'm heading to bed. Don't stay up too late." "I'll be right there," he called back, but his voice sounded strained. Sarah found him hunched over his desk, staring at an opened envelope. The contents weren't visible, but his hands trembled slightly as he quickly tucked whatever it was into his desk drawer. "Everything okay?" she asked, wrapping her arms around his shoulders from behind. David leaned back into her embrace. "Everything's fine, sweetheart. Just tired." They went to bed as they had for 18 years of marriage, Sarah reading her devotional while David reviewed his sermon notes. But tonight, David kept glancing toward his closed office door downstairs. Sarah fell asleep to the familiar sound of David's breathing beside her. She didn't know it would be the last time she'd hear it. The next morning, Sarah woke to silence. David's side of the bed was cold and empty. Assuming he'd gotten up early to review his lesson one more time, a habit during important Sundays, she showered and dressed for church. "Dad?" Emma called as she bounded down the stairs in her Sunday dress. "Mom says breakfast is ready." But the house remained quiet. David's coffee mug sat unused on the kitchen counter. His car keys hung on their usual hook by the garage door. Even his favorite leather Bible, the one he'd carried for 20 years, remained on his nightstand. Sarah felt the first flutter of concern. "Maybe he went for a walk to clear his head," she told Emma, though David had never done such a thing before church. By 8:30, with Sunday school starting in an hour, Sarah called Elder Thomas Wright. "Tom, have you seen David this morning? He's not here." Thomas, a retired police officer who'd been with the church since its founding, immediately sensed something wrong. "I'll be right over, Sarah." Within minutes, Thomas was at their front door. Together, they searched the house. David's wallet, identification, and even his wedding ring sat on his dresser. In his office, they found his computer still open to his sermon notes for that morning's service. But it was what they found in his desk drawer that made Sarah's blood run cold. The envelope David had been holding the night before was gone. In its place lay a handwritten note in David's careful script. "I'm sorry. Please don't look for me. Take care of Emma. D." By 9:15, Elder Wright had called 911. By 10 o'clock, Detective James Mitchell arrived at the Coleman house. beginning what would become one of Millbrook's most baffling missing person cases. The congregation gathered that morning as usual, but instead of David's warm greeting, they found Thomas Wright standing behind the pulpit with tears in his eyes. "Brothers and sisters," he began, his voice breaking, "Pastor David is missing. We need to come together in prayer." The last person to see David Coleman was Mrs. Henderson, their elderly neighbor, who spotted him around 11 p.m. Saturday night standing in his driveway, looking up at the stars. She remembered thinking it was odd. David usually didn't stay outside late, especially not in just his pajamas and slippers. As the police began their investigation, one thing became clear. David Coleman hadn't just disappeared. He had vanished completely, as if he'd never existed at all. Chapter 2. The investigation begins. Detective James Mitchell had worked missing person cases for 12 years, but something about Pastor Coleman's disappearance felt different from the start. Usually, when someone vanished without a trace, there were signs, financial troubles, marital problems, or health issues. But David Coleman seemed to have had none of these. Mitchell's first stop was Grace Baptist Church, where he found a congregation in complete shock. Elder Thomas Wright unlocked David's church office, revealing a space that looked frozen in time. David's sermon for that Sunday lay half-finished on his desk, his handwriting trailing off mid-sentence in the middle of a paragraph about forgiveness. "He seemed himself on Friday," Wright explained, adjusting his glasses nervously. "We had our weekly elder meeting. David was excited about the new youth program we're planning for next month." The detective photographed everything: the neat stacks of biblical commentaries, the family photo on David's desk showing him, Sarah and Emma at last year's church picnic, and most importantly, David's day planner. The last entry was for Saturday evening: review lesson, adultery passage. Back at the Coleman house, Mitchell interviewed Sarah more thoroughly. She sat in her living room, still wearing the navy dress she'd chosen for church that morning, her hands clutched around a cold cup of coffee. "Did David ever mention feeling threatened?" Mitchell asked. "Any problems with church members? Financial pressures?" Sarah shook her head. "David loved his work. Sure, we weren't wealthy on a pastor's salary, but we managed fine. And the congregation adored him. What about that note you found?" Sarah's voice barely rose above a whisper. "I've read it 100 times. It doesn't sound like David. He would never just leave Emma, never abandon his responsibilities." Emma, still in shock, could offer little additional information. "Dad tucked me in Friday night like always," she said, tears streaming down her face. "He said he loved me and reminded me about youth group next week." Mitchell's team conducted a thorough search of the Coleman property. They found no signs of struggle, no blood, no evidence of foul play. David's car remained in the garage, and his bank accounts showed no recent unusual activity. The last transaction was Friday afternoon, a $10 purchase at Murphy's Hardware for light bulbs. The detective expanded his search to include David's regular haunts around Millbrook. The owner of Mel's Diner, where David often grabbed coffee with other local pastors, hadn't seen him since Thursday. The librarian at Millbrook Public Library, where David researched his sermons, confirmed he'd checked out 3 biblical commentaries the previous Tuesday. All were found in his church office. As word of David's disappearance spread through the small town, theories began to emerge. Some whispered about a nervous breakdown. The pressures of pastoral life could break even the strongest men. Others suggested something more sinister, though no one could imagine who would want to hurt the beloved pastor. Mitchell interviewed every member of Grace Baptist's congregation over the following weeks. The picture that emerged was consistent. David Coleman was a devoted husband, loving father, and dedicated pastor without an enemy in the world. Mrs. Agnes Porter, the church pianist, remembered David seeming distracted during choir practice the Wednesday before his disappearance. "He kept checking his watch," she told Mitchell. "But David was always punctual, so I didn't think much of it." Young Timothy Brooks, a teenager in David's youth group, mentioned seeing the pastor's car parked at the town cemetery the Thursday before he vanished. "I thought maybe he was visiting someone's grave, you know." Pastor David did that sometimes for families who couldn't make it out there. This detail intrigued Mitchell. Millbrook Cemetery sat on the outskirts of town, a peaceful place where generations of the community's families rested. The detective drove out to investigate, walking among the weathered headstones and asking the groundskeeper if he'd noticed anything unusual. "Can't say I did," the elderly man replied, leaning on his rake. "Though now that you mention it, there was a car parked here late Thursday night when I was leaving. Didn't see who was driving." Mitchell examined the cemetery records, but found no recent burials that would explain David's visit. The mystery deepened. Meanwhile, the FBI was called in to assist with the case. Agent Lisa Rodriguez brought federal resources to bear, including database searches and analysis of David's computer and phone records. But even with expanded capabilities, the investigation yielded few clues. David's phone had been turned off since late Saturday night, and cell tower records show his last location as his own home. His computer history revealed nothing unusual, just research for sermons, emails with parishioners, and ordering church supplies online. 3 weeks into the investigation, Mitchell received the report he'd been dreading. Despite extensive searches, interviews with over 200 people, and analysis of every piece of evidence, they had no solid leads. David Coleman had simply vanished into thin air. The case remained active, but as months passed without new developments, it gradually moved to the back burner. Mitchell never officially closed it, though. Something about that handwritten note bothered him. The careful script seemed too composed for a man in crisis. Meanwhile, Grace Baptist Church struggled to heal. Sarah Coleman showed remarkable strength, continuing to attend services and supporting other families in the congregation. Emma threw herself into her studies, earning a scholarship to Tennessee State University. A year after David's disappearance, the church called Pastor Benjamin Hayes, a young seminary graduate, to fill the pulpit. Benjamin was kind and capable, but he wasn't David Coleman. The congregation slowly began to heal, though David's empty chair during elder meetings served as a constant reminder of their loss. But Detective Mitchell never forgot. Even years later, he would sometimes drive past the Coleman house or stop by Grace Baptist Church, hoping that something, anything, might provide the break the case needed. He had no idea that the answer lay hidden just feet away from where he stood each time he visited the church. Chapter 3, New Beginnings and Old Wounds. 5 years had passed since Pastor David Coleman's disappearance, and Millbrook had gradually settled into a new rhythm. Grace Baptist Church, under Pastor Benjamin Hayes' leadership, had grown from 200 to nearly 300 members. Benjamin, now 35 and married to his college sweetheart Rebecca, brought fresh energy to the congregation while respectfully honoring David's memory. Sarah Coleman had found her own path forward. After 2 years of grief counseling through the church, she'd taken a job at Millbrook Elementary School as a reading specialist. The work gave her purpose, and the children's laughter helped heal wounds that seemed impossible to mend. She still lived in the same house, still attended Grace Baptist every Sunday, sitting in the third pew where she and David had sat for 15 years. Emma had graduated from Tennessee State with a degree in social work and returned to Millbrook to start her career at the county's Department of Children's Services. At 26, she was known for her compassion and dedication to helping troubled families, qualities that reminded everyone of her father. Detective Mitchell, now nearing retirement, had been promoted to lieutenant, but never closed David's case. The file remained on his desk, and he still received occasional tips from well-meaning citizens who thought they'd spotted the missing pastor in neighboring counties. None ever panned out. The church itself had evolved too. Elder Thomas Wright, now in his 70s, had stepped down from leadership but remained active in the congregation. New families had joined, young couples who'd heard about Grace Baptist's welcoming community, but knew David Coleman only as the beloved pastor who'd vanished mysteriously. Pastor Benjamin had carefully navigated the delicate task of following a legend. He'd kept David's office exactly as it was for the first 2 years, consulting with Sarah before making any changes. Eventually, practical needs forced some modifications, new filing systems, updated technology, a fresh coat of paint. But David's personal items remained untouched in a cabinet Benjamin had installed specifically for that purpose. It was during this period of growth that the church board began discussing much-needed renovations to the fellowship hall. The building, constructed in the 1960s, showed its age. The carpet was worn thin, the kitchen appliances dated, and the Sunday school classrooms needed modernization to accommodate the growing children's ministry. The renovation project became a church-wide effort. Families contributed both money and labor, with weekend work parties becoming joyful community events. Sarah Coleman surprised everyone by volunteering to help with the painting, saying it felt good to be part of building something positive. Emma threw herself into the project too, working alongside other young adults to strip old wallpaper and prepare surfaces for painting. It was therapeutic work that allowed her to feel connected to the church where her father had served so faithfully. The renovation uncovered typical old building surprises, outdated wiring that needed replacement, plumbing issues that required professional attention, and structural quirks that had to be addressed. Each discovery added to the timeline and budget, but the congregation remained enthusiastic about the improvements. During this phase, something unexpected happened that briefly reignited interest in David's disappearance. While updating the church's filing system, Pastor Benjamin discovered a box of old documents that had been stored in a corner of David's office closet. Among the papers were financial records, old bulletin drafts, and meeting minutes going back decades. But tucked between pages of a 2015 budget report, Benjamin found something that made his blood run cold: a photocopy of a letter addressed to David, dated just 3 days before his disappearance. The letter was from someone named Mr. and contained only a few cryptic lines. "David, we need to meet, you know why. Saturday night, usual place. Don't disappoint me again." Benjamin immediately called Lieutenant Mitchell, who arrived at the church within an hour. The discovery prompted a brief renewal of the investigation, with Mitchell tracking down anyone with the initials Mr. who might have known David. But after weeks of interviews and analysis, the letter led nowhere. The handwriting couldn't be matched to anyone in David's known circle, and no one remembered David mentioning someone with those initials. Sarah examined the letter, hoping it might provide closure, but it only deepened her pain. "He was meeting someone that night," she told Mitchell. "Someone he never mentioned to me." The discovery cast a shadow over the renovation project, reminding everyone that David's disappearance remained an open wound in their community. But gradually, as the physical transformation of the fellowship hall progressed, the congregation's focus returned to the positive changes taking place. By year 7, Grace Baptist had become one of Millbrook's most vibrant churches. Pastor Benjamin's sermons drew visitors from neighboring towns, and the youth ministry had tripled in size. The renovated fellowship hall hosted community events, wedding receptions, and holiday celebrations. Emma Coleman met and fell in love with Marcus Thompson, a teacher at Millbrook High School who'd started attending Grace Baptist after moving to town. Their relationship blossomed slowly, with Marcus understanding and respecting the complex grief that still touched Emma's life. When he proposed during the church's annual Christmas pageant, at the same spot where Emma had played an angel as a child, there wasn't a dry eye in the sanctuary. Sarah watched her daughter's happiness with joy tinged by sadness. David should have been there to walk Emma down the aisle, to offer fatherly advice about marriage, to welcome Marcus into their family. But she was grateful for the healing she witnessed in Emma's life. As the 8th anniversary of David's disappearance approached, Lieutenant Mitchell made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. He announced his retirement and revealed that he was donating his personal time to a final comprehensive review of David Coleman's case. "I'm going to spend my retirement years on this," he told Sarah during a visit to her classroom. "Something about your husband's disappearance has never sat right with me. I think we missed something important." Sarah squeezed his hand. "Thank you, James. It means more than you know to have someone who hasn't given up." Mitchell's retirement investigation would prove more prescient than anyone imagined. Because just 1 year later, as Grace Baptist prepared for another phase of renovations, this time to expand the sanctuary itself, workers would make a discovery that would shatter everything the community thought they knew about Pastor David Coleman's disappearance. The truth had been hiding in plain sight for nearly a decade, waiting behind walls that thousands of people passed every Sunday, never suspecting the secrets that lay just inches away from their prayers and worship. Chapter 4. The Discovery. 9 years after Pastor David Coleman's disappearance, Grace Baptist Church was thriving beyond anyone's expectations. The congregation had grown to over 400 members, necessitating a major expansion of the sanctuary. Pastor Benjamin Hayes, now a beloved figure in his own right, had guided the church through its most successful decade in history. The expansion project was the church's most ambitious undertaking ever. Unlike the Fellowship Hall renovation 2 years earlier, this required professional contractors and architects. The plan called for extending the sanctuary by 30 feet, adding a new choir loft, and modernizing the entire worship space while preserving its traditional character. Emma Coleman Thompson, now married for 18 months, served on the building committee alongside her mother Sarah, who had become something of an unofficial church historian. Lieutenant Mitchell, true to his word, continued his private investigation into David's disappearance, though his leads had grown increasingly cold. The demolition phase began on a crisp October Monday, the same month, ironically, when David had vanished 9 years earlier. Thompson Construction, a reputable firm from Nashville, sent a crew led by foreman Jake Morrison, a methodical man who'd worked on church renovations throughout Tennessee. The first week proceeded smoothly. Workers carefully removed pews, dismantled the old sound system, and prepared for the structural changes. The atmosphere was festive, with church members stopping by daily to check progress and bring coffee and donuts to the construction crew. It was during the second week, while expanding the foundation for the new addition, that Morrison's crew encountered an unexpected obstacle. The blueprints indicated the basement wall should extend straight back, but ground-penetrating radar revealed an anomaly, a hollow space behind what appeared to be solid masonry. Morrison called Pastor Benjamin immediately. "Reverend, we've got a situation here. Looks like there might be some kind of void behind this wall. Could be an old root cellar or storage area that wasn't marked on the original building plans." Benjamin arrived with Elder Thomas Wright, who despite his advanced age remained sharp and knowledgeable about the church's history. Wright examined the wall carefully, running his weathered hands over the mortar joints. "This masonry work is different," Wright observed. "Newer than the rest of the foundation. I'd guess it was added sometime in the 1990s, maybe early 2000s. The timing sent a chill through Benjamin's spine. David Coleman had become pastor in 2001, and the renovation records showed he'd overseen several building improvements during his early years of ministry. Morrison suggested bringing in specialized equipment to examine the void without damaging the structural integrity of the building. By Thursday, a team from Memphis arrived with advanced scanning equipment that could map the hidden space in detail. The results were stunning. Behind the newer masonry lay a small room, approximately 8 feet by 10 feet, completely sealed off from the rest of the basement. The scans indicated the presence of objects within the space: furniture, possibly boxes, and something else that the technicians couldn't identify. Pastor Benjamin called an emergency meeting of the church board that evening. The discussion was heated and difficult. Some members wanted to open the sealed room immediately, driven by curiosity and the hope of solving David's disappearance. Others worried about what they might find and the impact on the congregation. Sarah Coleman attended the meeting, her face pale but determined. "If there's any chance this relates to David, I need to know," she said quietly. "Our family has lived with questions for 9 years. Whatever's in there, it can't be worse than not knowing." Lieutenant Mitchell, contacted by Pastor Benjamin, arrived the next morning with a warrant to examine the sealed room. The retired detective had maintained his law enforcement contacts and convinced the current sheriff to treat this as a potential crime scene. The breakthrough came on Friday afternoon. Using careful demolition techniques, Morrison's crew created a small opening in the newer masonry wall. Morrison shined a powerful flashlight through the gap, and what he saw made him step back in shock. "Jesus Christ," he whispered, forgetting he was in a church basement. "What is it?" Mitchell demanded. Morrison's voice was barely audible. "There's someone in there." The room was immediately sealed as a crime scene. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation arrived within hours, followed by the county coroner and a team of forensic specialists. The church property was cordoned off, and congregants gathered in small groups on the street, whispering prayers and theories in equal measure. The careful excavation took most of Saturday. Using specialized equipment and forensic protocols, investigators gradually widened the opening and documented everything before anyone entered the sealed space. What they found inside defied everyone's expectations and solved a mystery while creating an even bigger one. The small room had been carefully constructed as a living space. There was a cot with blankets, a small table with a battery-powered lamp, boxes of canned food and bottled water, a portable camping toilet, and dozens of books, including multiple copies of the Bible and theological texts. And there, sitting in a chair facing the sealed entrance, were the skeletal remains of a man wearing the tattered remnants of clothes that Sarah Coleman immediately recognized as her husband's favorite cardigan and khaki pants. But the mystery deepened with each piece of evidence uncovered. Medical examination confirmed the remains were those of David Coleman, but the cause of death wasn't immediately apparent. There were no signs of violence, no trauma to the bones. More puzzling were the personal effects found in the room. David's wallet contained his identification and credit cards, along with nearly $3,000 in cash, money that had never been withdrawn from any known account. His wedding ring, which Sarah had found on his dresser the morning he disappeared, was on his finger. Most shocking of all was a journal, remarkably well preserved in the dry environment, filled with David's handwriting. The entries began the day after his disappearance and continued for what appeared to be several weeks. The first entry, dated the Sunday he was supposed to teach Sunday school, began, "I had no choice. They would never understand. This is the only way to protect my family and my congregation from the truth of what I've done." As investigators continued their work and forensic experts analyzed the evidence, one fact became clear: David Coleman hadn't been murdered or kidnapped. He had voluntarily sealed himself in this hidden room beneath his own church. But why? And how had he managed to survive for weeks in this self-imposed prison before ultimately dying alone in the darkness? The answers lay within the pages of his journal, revelations that would rock the foundation of Grace Baptist Church and forever change how Millbrook remembered their beloved pastor. The truth was more complex and heartbreaking than anyone had imagined. Chapter 5. The Final Truth. The forensic analysis of Pastor David Coleman's journal took 3 weeks, but its contents would haunt Millbrook for years to come. Lieutenant Mitchell, working closely with the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, carefully reviewed each entry, building a timeline that finally explained the beloved pastor's mysterious disappearance. The journal revealed a man tormented by a secret that had consumed him for months before his disappearance. David Coleman, the pillar of moral strength his congregation had trusted for 15 years, had been living a lie that grew too heavy to bear. The truth began 18 months before David's disappearance, during what should have been a routine pastoral counseling session. Monica Richards, a 34-year-old single mother struggling with addiction and custody issues, had sought David's help getting her life back on track. The sessions had started professionally, but over months, boundaries had blurred in ways that violated everything David believed about his calling and his marriage. The affair had lasted only 2 months, ending when David's conscience finally overpowered his weakness. But Monica, desperate and unstable, hadn't accepted the end gracefully. She'd begun making threats, first subtle, then increasingly explicit. She demanded money to keep quiet, threatened to tell Sarah and the congregation, and eventually claimed to be pregnant with David's child. The cryptic letter found years later in David's office had been one of many such communications. Mar, Monica Richards had been blackmailing David for over a year, demanding regular payments to maintain her silence. The stress had been eating him alive, but he'd seen no way out that wouldn't destroy his family and his church. The journal entries painted a picture of a man in spiritual and emotional crisis. David had been embezzling small amounts from church funds to pay Monica, a betrayal that compounded his guilt exponentially. He'd been living in constant fear that his secrets would be exposed, knowing that the revelation would not only end his ministry, but potentially destroy Grace Baptist Church entirely. The breaking point had come the Saturday night before his disappearance. Monica had demanded a final payment of $20,000, money David didn't have access to without triggering bank investigations. She'd threatened to attend Sunday service and publicly reveal their affair if he didn't comply. David's final journal entries described his mental state that night. "I cannot face Sarah. I cannot face Emma. I cannot stand before my congregation knowing what I've done. The hypocrisy is killing me more surely than any disease. I've preached about adultery, about integrity, about faithfulness to God and family, while living the darkest kind of lie." The sealed room beneath the church had been David's solution, a place where he could disappear without technically abandoning his family or his responsibilities. He'd spent months secretly constructing the space during late-night visits to the church, using his pastoral key access to work undetected. His plan had been to vanish completely, leaving the note that would prevent extensive searching while allowing his family to move on with their lives. He'd stocked the room with supplies, believing he could live there indefinitely while the investigation eventually died down, then somehow start a new life elsewhere. But David had underestimated both the physical and psychological toll of his self-imposed exile. The journal entries grew increasingly erratic as days passed in the sealed room. He wrote about hearing the congregation gathering for services above him, about listening to Pastor Benjamin's voice echoing through the floorboards as his replacement took over the pulpit. The most heartbreaking entries describe David listening to his own memorial service 6 months after his disappearance. "They're mourning a man who never really existed," he wrote. "The David Coleman they loved was a fiction I created to hide my failures. Maybe it's better this way." Medical examination suggested David had survived in the sealed room for approximately 4 to 6 weeks before succumbing to what appeared to be natural causes, likely a heart attack brought on by stress, poor nutrition, and the psychological trauma of his situation. His body had remained preserved in the dry, sealed environment for 9 years. The investigation into Monica Richards revealed she had left Tennessee shortly after David's disappearance, moving first to Florida, then to California, where she died in a car accident 3 years later. She'd never collected the final payment she'd demanded, and apparently never revealed David's secret to anyone. The revelation devastated Grace Baptist Church in ways that surpassed even David's initial disappearance. Members struggled to reconcile the man they'd loved and trusted with the flawed human being revealed in his journal. Some felt betrayed and angry, while others expressed deep sadness for David's suffering and the impossible situation he'd created for himself. Sarah Coleman's response surprised many. After the initial shock wore off, she spoke to the congregation with remarkable grace and dignity. "David was a good man who made terrible mistakes," she said during a packed Sunday service. "His choices hurt our family and this church. But I choose to remember the years of faithful service, the lives he touched positively, and the love he showed our family even while struggling with his own demons." Emma struggled more with the revelations. The father she'd idolized was revealed to have feet of clay, and she grappled with anger, disappointment, and grief for the man she thought she'd known. Marriage counseling with Marcus helped her process the complex emotions, and eventually, she found a measure of peace. Pastor Benjamin Hayes faced perhaps the greatest challenge. Half his congregation wanted to pretend the journal had never been found, while others demanded extensive soul-searching about how such deception could have flourished undetected. Benjamin chose transparency, preaching a series of sermons about human frailty, forgiveness, and the difference between the office of pastor and the flawed people who fill it. The church ultimately survived the crisis, though it lost some members and took years to fully heal. David's story became a cautionary tale about the dangers of secret sin and the importance of accountability, even for spiritual leaders. Lieutenant Mitchell closed his investigation with mixed feelings. He'd solved the case that had haunted him for years, but the truth brought little satisfaction. "Sometimes the mystery is kinder than the answer," he told Sarah during one of their final conversations about the case. 9 years after Pastor David Coleman vanished, Millbrook finally had its answers. They weren't the answers anyone had hoped for, but they were complete and final. David Coleman had been neither victim nor villain, but simply a broken man who'd made a series of tragic choices that ultimately cost him everything he'd claimed to value most. Grace Baptist Church completed its renovation the following year, but the basement room where David had died was filled in and sealed permanently. A small memorial garden was planted outside the church in David's memory, with a simple plaque that read, "In memory of Pastor David Coleman, beloved husband, father, and servant. May his struggle remind us that we are all in need of grace." The truth had set them free, but freedom came with the responsibility of living honestly with complexity, forgiveness, and the acknowledgement that even the most trusted leaders are capable of profound failures. In the end, David Coleman's greatest sermon wasn't delivered from a pulpit, but written in the pages of a journal found in a sealed room, a message about the destructive power of hidden sin and the tragic consequences of believing that we must bear our burdens alone. Final reflection. Pastor David Coleman's story serves as a powerful reminder that even those we look up to as spiritual leaders are human beings capable of making grave mistakes. His tragedy wasn't just in his moral failure, but in his belief that he had to face his struggles alone, without the grace and forgiveness that he preached to others every Sunday. This case shows us the importance of authentic community, accountability, and the understanding that redemption is possible even in our darkest moments. David's greatest mistake wasn't his affair or even his embezzlement. It was his choice to isolate himself, rather than seek the help and grace that his faith taught was always available. His story challenges us to create communities where people feel safe to be honest about their struggles before they become overwhelming burdens. It reminds us that behind every person, even those in positions of authority and trust, lies a human heart capable of both great love and profound failure. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit that like button if this story impacted you. Share your thoughts in the comments below and let us know what cases you'd like us to cover next. Remember, truth is often stranger and more complex than fiction, and every mystery solved teaches us something about the human condition.